Good to see you. Next time, it would be wonderful if we could do that face-to-face in Bloomington or Berlin or both. But for now, thanks to the miracle of Zoom, here we are together. So that's great. We had the pleasure of hosting you live at a conference of our institute some few years ago. Now we continue in the webinar mode, but it's a good mode for what it is we want to talk about. I also add my welcome to everyone else who's now tuned in. We have a sizable audience of interested people who will be hearing Sina Arnold speak about anti-Semitism on the American left. We have already had two recent presentations about anti-Semitism on the right, and we all recognize that, in fact, hostility to Jews, Judaism, the Jewish state, comes from many different directions. What we're doing in these separate webinars is segmenting them to some degree, but today's session on the left is a way, in fact, to take a good hard look, especially within the American context, about these hostile sentiments coming from that direction. I should add that we will have two more in this series in December, and then we're going to take a pause for a while, but we're already lining up speakers for the resumption of our webinar series in 2022, so stay tuned for things that'll be upcoming. Our speaker today is one of Germany's most active and brightest and most productive younger scholars of anti-Semitism. She works as a senior lecturer and research at the Technische Universität in Berlin, specifically at the Center for Research on Antisemitism, and simultaneously at a research institute devoted to the study of social cohesion. Her work focuses on anti-Semitism in Germany and in America. She is also keenly interested in the politics right now that's fueling some very heated, intense debates about memory, Holocaust memory, especially in Germany. She looks at migration and racism. She's done one-on-one personal qualitative interviews with newcomers to Germany from a number of Middle Eastern countries, a kind of research that finds a parallel in work that Günther and his colleagues have done likewise. So how, in the midst of all of that, she's also raising a 3-year-old and trying to stay on the bright side of life. I'm not altogether sure, but she does. Sina, a pleasure to have you with us. From this point on, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thanks to both of you for having me. And I'm honored to contribute to this series of webinars. And Günther already hinted at the fact that what I will present are some empirical results from a study I conducted a few years ago, and I'll also add some more recent observation and analysis. And in the coming year, a much longer version of that will appear in a book with Indiana University Press. And also, again, thank you to Alvin Rosenfeld for endorsing that project, helping it move along. Now, as to my topic, I think all of you listening in, you are aware of the fact that in the recent years, the topic of left anti-Semitism has been on the rise again, has gained visibility. There are many, many examples. It seems like somehow all the major progressive campaigns had some kind of anti-Semitism scandal surrounding it, be it around the Women's March and figures such as Linda Sarsour, or the Black Lives Matter mobilization, and the question whether some protesters deliberately targeted Jewish stores or Jewish individuals even. And of course, one other ongoing scene has been the debate around university campuses and the progressive student groups there, pro-Palestinian student groups there, a matter that's also been discussed in this series of webinars. And I'll come to some of these examples, but I'm, rather than just kind of listing them, I'm more interested in what drives them, what's behind them, and kind of the question that I want to share with you. And I thought this would be, there. So I'm much rather interested in what I call anti-Semitism discourses. So what's going on there? How does anti-Semitic speech manifest itself? I mean, what kind of anti-Semitism do we find, in other words? But also speech about anti-Semitism. What do leftists think about this phenomenon? How and when do activists talk about anti-Semitism? And in what context? What are the related topoi that they talk about it? And finally, what are the conditions, the historical conditions, the theoretical framing, and the political conditions that enable these positions? So basically, basically I start off with a sense of naive surprise in a way, thinking that, if the left claims to be a movement that's about egalitarianism, that's about anti-discrimination, why do we find anti-Semitism on the left, and what forms? How is that possible? So I want to kind of get to the heart of that. And what I want to do is, based on my research, I want to show you what I think are the key characteristics of left anti-Semitism discourses. I want to turn to explanations, what I call the enabling conditions. I also want to talk about the political effects that has. And in the end, I kind of want to talk about what to do with it, where to go from here, but also together with you in the end, I hope. And what I base this on is, Günther hinted at that. I'm an anthropologist by training, a social anthropologist. So I do research, and I have done qualitative interviews with activists from about 16 different groups, progressive groups, left groups. They have a wide age range. You can see that here, between 19 and 73 years old. 16 of them were Jewish, 14 were Christian, atheist, or Muslim. In the widest sense, they were active in Occupy Wall Street, in the anti-war movement, and pro-Palestinian groups, and in Jewish organizations. And so in the widest sense, we're talking about the extra-parliamentary radical left here, for reasons that I can go into later if you're interested in that. On top of that, I've analyzed movement literature, and I've also done participant observation. So I've been to lots of demonstrations, to marches, to events, all of which was a decade ago, 2010, 11, 12. I will talk about why I think my research is still relevant, not just because I've updated it continuously and I followed the discussions, but also because we see a lot of ideas, notions that are so at the core of left theory and activism that they're going to stick with us for a while. Let's put it that way, and maybe also as to why this kind of research. Not only has it often not been done when we talk about anti-Semitism on the left, there's very few empirical research, but also I think for me it was fairly easy to do because this is where I come from politically. I've been part of left movements, anti-fascist movements against anti-Semitism and racism. And I think this gave me, in a way, kind of unique access to these kind of spaces. And I don't mean that in a strategic sense, but really in the sense of kind of wanting to be a critical ally, wanting to understand what's going on, being critical of inner movement debates and tendencies, and wanting to understand why that topic is such a blind spot in the American left, and what can be done about that. And coming from a German perspective, where some of these debates are similar, some of these developments have been different in the past 20 years. So as to the key characteristics, maybe the first one, the fact that there's very little what I would call overt anti-Semitism. What I mean by that is explicit use of anti-Semitic stereotypes, stereotypical notions of Jews, widespread anti-religious, anti-Jewish religious stereotypes. And I was also surprised that like Jews as a whole were not associated necessarily with stereotypes like excessive capitalism, excessive clannishness. However, I did find, or I do find and do see that the notion of Jewish dual loyalty, so the idea that Jews feel more connected to Israel than to the United States. And in my interviews, many of the non-Jewish interviews express the notion of excessive power, excessive Jewish power and influence. Time and again citing the influence, the politics of Jewish interest groups, or the visibility of Holocaust remembrance. So this, if we look at the kind of classical anti-Jewish stereotypes, this is the most common one. And here, I'll come to that later, but in general, Jewish and non-Jewish respondents don't have, I have a lot of similarities, but here, the Jewish respondents tended to reject these ideas of like, you know, of Jewish power, of excessive Jewish influence. Now, when I talk about anti-Semitism, you know, I generally speak about more than a simple set of stereotypes. Anti-Semitism is an ideology, it's a worldview, it's what Theodor Adorno and Else Frenkel-Brunswick in their 1950s study, The Authoritarian Personality, have called a general frame of mind, referring to that ideological character of anti-Semitism. And I was surprised that I didn't find that so much. I don't find that coherence. I don't find that worldview where the Jew, quote unquote, is the key to all questions that boggle us. But I'll come to that later. When we look at the role that Israel plays, there's something that has some similarities, but in the traditional sense, I didn't find that so much. However, I want to share one example with you. A 50-year-old respondent that I'm going to call Bob. I mean, all the interviews have been anonymized. He is someone where individual stereotypes get condensed into a single picture. He's the member of a socialist organization and regards Judaism as a backward-looking religion, and has the idea that the world is ruled by a secret group that's acting behind the scenes as a shadow government, a government that controls the US, controls its president, and a cabal that includes white Protestants, but also Jewish families like the Rothschilds. And he also complains about the power of Jews in finance and politics. So he said something like that. I'm going to read it out. It's gotten to the point where the Jewish community in America, who are very powerful, very, very powerful people, very influential, and I mean with the government, and I mean with foreign policy and domestic policy. What community is it that you're talking about? The Jewish community, the American Jewish community, with their ties to Israel and the influence and the arm twisting in American government and American business. They wield a lot of power, and one of their main weapons is to use anti-Semitism. In this interview, also the boundaries between the Israeli government, Israelis and American Jews get blurred, and American Jews are seen as primarily loyal to Israel and held responsible for Israel's policies. Again, I'm showing this because it's fairly marginal, this all-encompassing worldview, this open use of stereotypes, but it can be found. In a similar fashion, maybe this image fits, which also happens to be a preliminary glimpse at a possible book cover, where we're talking about different ones at the moment. But this gentleman who was seen at Occupy Wall Street protests in New York 2011 down at Zuccotti Parks, and he repeatedly ran around with similar conspiratorial signs hinting at excessive Jewish power, claiming to have like a secret knowledge that others don't have. And you see also here that there were some counter voices. But nevertheless, I did a lot of participant observation at Occupy Wall Street. And what struck me is how very few counter voices there were towards these kind of expressions of anti-Semitism. And my sense is that there's a certain double standard when it comes to anti-Semitism and, for example, racism or sexism or homophobia, where you had like a lively debate at Occupy Wall Street around the inner movement sexism, the inner movement racism. Whereas with anti-Semitism, and this is my second observation, it's more or less tolerated. It's something, and that is something that I call anti-Semitic trivialization. And I would say that really, this is the most striking feature of left discourses on anti-Semitism. It's a certain indifference and it's a lack of empathy. And I think this is actually the more worrying feature. And again, this is not something new, especially, I mean, even when we look back many decades, when we look at the New Left, there were commentators who noted an anti-Semitism of indifference, is I think Arthur Liebman called it, in the 60s. Jewish feminists in the 80s, which is a really interesting period when we look at how the American left talked about this. Jewish feminists like Lady Pogrebin, Irina Klepfis, they spoke of, and this is a quote, the hidden disease of the movement. And another quote, an anti-Semitism by omission. Robert Fine has talked about anti-Semitism denial, and Arthur Liebman, Arthur Liebman coined a different term. He spoke of he spoke about the insensitivity thesis of left anti-Semitism. So you see different academics and activists have noticed this, what I would call anti-Semitism trivialization. So how did this come about in my interviews? Generally, Jewish and non-Jewish respondents ignored or downplayed the question of worldwide anti-Semitism. So some said, yes, it's something that exists somewhere in Europe, but they said, this does not apply neither to the Arab world, nor to the political left, nor to the United States. And I mean, keep in mind, 10 years ago, my sense is that nowadays this would not be so easy to say anymore. Everyone is aware of the fact that there is a problem with anti-Semitism in the United States. But at the time of the study, people say anti-Semitism is simply not a serious problem, basically hardly anywhere. This is what one interview partner said, mostly a lighthearted thing. It's mostly a lighthearted thing. And if it was addressed at all, it was always in the context of other forms of oppression. So a kind of displacement occurs when talking about anti-Semitism, a discursive shift in two directions, either towards racism or other forms of racism, Islamophobia or anti-Black racism, or towards accusations of anti-Semitism. So claiming that anti-Semitism is not a problem, but the problem is that we get accused, or people get accused of anti-Semitism. And interestingly enough, this indifference is also linked to the past. So everyone says yes, we condemn the Holocaust. I mean, everyone condemns the Holocaust, unless they're like a diehard Nazi. But we're skeptical of contemporary Holocaust remembrance. It's commercialized, it's instrumental, it takes the attention away from other forms of mass violence. So in other words, anti-Semitism is simply not on the agenda. And I spoke with, I'm going to call him Nimrod, he's a young anarchist who's critical. He's critical of these developments, and he reflects upon his socialization in mostly like anti-fascist circles. And he says, as a person raised this way on the left, I feel like the problem is no one talks about it. When I was coming into activism, you had to talk about race. You had to talk about gender. You had to criticize these things or people were going to call you out. So you have to really sit there and decompress and really read and understand where your power is and how that affects other people. And you never really do that. You never really understand how you are anti-Semitic or how you view Jewish people. Yeah, and so the third feature, and it's kind of linked to this, is a certain defensiveness against accusations of anti-Semitism. And this is like, you know, it's either whether it comes from inside the movement or outside the left, any accusation of anti-Semitism is almost automatically rejected. And of course, this dynamic is most visible when it comes to any linkages with anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel. Now, David Hirsch, who was also a speaker in this webinar series, and I think he spoke about this also, he termed it the Livingston formula after the former mayor of London. And two aspects come together. The first is the automatic rejection of charges of anti-Semitism. And by automatic, I mean that charges are not listened to and then, you know, and then considered whether they are maybe true or not, or exaggerated or so, but they're automatically rejected. And again, here's a double standard that we don't see when we talk about racism or sexism, for example. I take these examples because Nimrod also used them. Usually charges of racism or sexism, they need to be listened to. They are taken seriously. They are sometimes also rejected, but there's not this automatic rejection because the self-understanding is, yeah, if we get called out for this, then this is something we have to take seriously. And a self-understanding that, yeah, as people being socialized in a structurally racist or patriarchal or heteronormative society, then as leftists, this is something that we've also inherited. So we need to, we should be called out for it. And the second feature is that the assumption that those who make accusations of anti-Semitism do so purely for strategic reasons, mostly to defend Israel. So, this notion that any accusation of anti-Semitism is purely instrumental, it's purely strategic. And this is this interesting dynamic that I just described. Instead of talking about anti-Semitism, many leftists almost exclusively talk about accusations of anti-Semitism, of the abuse of anti-Semitism. Yeah, and I mean, one example that I was thinking of is that you may remember the controversies around Ilhan Omar, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and her anti-Israel comments. It's all about the Benjamins and so on. And she was accused of anti-Semitism from various people. She apologized for some of her comments. And certainly, some of the accusations she received were nasty, were done on social media, had racist undertones to them towards her as a Black Muslim woman. But interestingly enough, a variety of left media outlets condemned her apology, and the prominent left magazine Jacobin unleashed a deluge of headlines proclaiming Ilhan Omar was right, Ilhan Omar is not anti-Semitic, Democrats are failing Ilhan Omar. These are all headlines. Only very few left commentators actually criticized her statements. Most defenses focused on the bad faith of her critics, the Islamophobia of her critics, and no one mentioned that Jews were hurt at her words, that Jews called her out, and non-Jews also, but that she was called out for anti-Semitism. And I think same was with the accusations against Women's March leader Linda Sarsour, which immediately were answered with the hashtag I stand with Linda. And no one really talked about the actual accusations. Instead, we saw this big defensiveness. And the fourth feature is a very one-sided critique of Israel. And of course, it's no surprise the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It's one of the central discourses for debates on anti-Semitism. There's a self-evident critique of Israel, and it's characterized by 5 double standards that you see here. I'll walk you through them. The first one is what I would call a double standard of salience. So that's something that gives the Israeli-Palestinian conflict priority over other international conflicts and disproportionately high attention in political activist work. The second is a double standard of state foundation that marks Israel's beginnings as artificial, as violent, and contrasts that with the origins of other alleged somewhat organic states. And then there's a double standard of state formation that sees Israel as anachronistic, as a colonial imperial regime that's pursuing an archaic form of expansionist policy. And then the double standard of self-understanding, which criticizes Israel as a specifically ethno-religious state, but at the same time ignores the fact that numerous other states have also been founded, have also been constructed in this way. On the basis of this, most respondents advocate a one-state solution. However, hardly anyone, at least in my interviews, denied Israel's right to exist, at least not, in the strict sense of the word. And then finally, a double standard of self-determination that recognizes Palestinians' rights to decide their own means of struggle, which goes sometimes so far as to show an understanding for suicide bombings. Not very often, but that happens. But rejects this decision for means of struggle for Israelis. So in other words, the danger and the rage on the Palestinian side of the conflict as seen as legitimate, as valid, as understanding, and the concerns of the Israeli Jewish side of the conflict are not understood in the same way, are not taken seriously. Now, maybe to be clear, I don't think that these double standards are per se necessarily anti-Semitic. We can talk about this later. I do work with the IRA definition, but I do think that we shouldn't take it as a checklist, or that if we look at another analytical tool that that Neisner-Sharansky's 3Ds, that one D is kind of enough. I think what we need is a context-sensitive analysis of left anti-Semitism discourse, and I understand the IRA definition to be providing that. The IRA definition also calls for looking at the context. But maybe that just as a footnote. What I do think, however, is that these 4 characteristics of left anti-Semitism discourse really need to be explained. So why do these isolated stereotypes appear? Why is anti-Semitism met with indifference? Even though it should be taken into account, given a general anti-racist, anti-discriminatory logic of a left worldview. Why is there defensiveness against dealing with accusations of anti-Semitism, and why this one-sided critique of Israel? I think if we look at the explanations, or what I would call the kind of enabling conditions of anti-Semitism discourses, I would distinguish between kind of the social and historical context as kind of the macro level, then leftist theory as the kind of in-between level, and then identity as a form of micro level. And if we look at the social and historical context, I think one factor until recently has been the relative low level of open anti-Semitism in the United States. As you know, this has dramatically changed since 2016. The Trump presidency has legitimated more kind of brazen forms of anti-Semitism. The alt-right and neo-Nazi movement have begun to visibly target Jews once again. So we see a change here, but until recently, for many activists, and this includes Jewish activists, it was something that they didn't see as an everyday problem, especially when compared, and we see a competitive dynamic here, especially compared to anti-Black and anti-Arab racism, and especially when focusing on structural discrimination. I think also the social positioning of Jews, I don't have that as an extra point, but the social positioning of many Jews in the United States, so an upward mobility after 45, makes it hard, that's what a lot of leftists say, to see Jews as victims, but rather perceiving them as privileged. And this, victimhood and privilege are two kind of central categories of current left debates. And it's really hard to kind of make the plight of a group heard when they're seen as privileged. I think another key factor is the context of struggle against anti-Semitism. What many leftists claim is the fact that Holocaust remembrance is already visible. It takes place on many levels of society. The demand to remember, and this is a difference, for example, to my experience in the German context, demand to remember does not open up a battlefield in a sense for the left. But this opens the door for making anti-Semitism in the past less visible, and it also opens the door for kind of victimhood competition and for Holocaust denial or distortion in the if it's taken really far. And then also another reason that is given, the fact that numerous organizations currently track anti-Semitism in the US. Some of them also address Israel-related leftist or Arab anti-Semitism. And according to many leftists, and this is, this is where this weird perception comes in. This activity is simply strategically motivated to distract people from Israel human rights violations. So the mere mention of anti-Semitism can thus be perceived as racist. And this is something that also I encounter time and again when talking to interview partners about the political activism we did in Germany, campaigns against anti-Semitism. I was immediately perceived as someone who has to come from the political right. When you talk about anti-Semitism, then you must come from the political right, and by extension be a Zionist, and by extension be a racist. So if you do the short version of that equation, when you talk about anti-Semitism, when you struggle against anti-Semitism, then by extension you are seen as a racist. I mean, I'm simplifying, but this is a logic that I've encountered several times actually. And the fourth kind of factor in this political, social, historical context is the fact that Israel is seen, or is but de facto the United States' most important ally in the Middle East, is a strategic partner. It receives large amounts of foreign aids, and I think this is something that contributes to this, what I call the double standard of salience. It explains why Israel is more a focus than many other countries. It doesn't explain it exclusively. There's also a moment or there's other explanations. There's also possible anti-Semitism as an explanation, but it's, it can't be denied, and it's again a difference also to the German case. I think more important is the level of theoretical foundations, theoretical traditions that enable these specific positions on Jews and on Israel. I think at the moment, the most important influential factor, and I think it's becoming more important, is the current dominant frame of racism and the anti-racist positions that come from it. And or maybe as a disclaimer, of course, anti-racism has primarily preventive effects on the articulation of anti-Semitic stereotypes. It also explains why there is very little overt anti-Semitism. It explains why there's really few instances of open attacks on Jews. I mean, this is a large difference to the extreme right. However, the concrete content of current anti-racism can have the effect of tolerating anti-Semitism. Or maybe, again, a disclaimer, I think there's a lot to be gained from what is currently simplified as critical race theory. And I see it as a problem how it's become kind of the signifier that stands for political camps. So what I'm saying here is not meant as kind of an overarching statement of post-colonial theory or critical race theory, but more concretely, the kind of dominance of what is sometimes labeled critical whiteness studies. So something that is happening in academia in connection with activist circles and is very dominant in activist circles. It has helped bring this category of white privilege to the fore. And based on a kind of analysis of hierarchical group relations, Jews in this paradigm are necessarily located on the winning side of the racialized hierarchy. And I'm putting this in quotes. And it contributes to making anti-Semitism invisible. So Jews are, in the left, often expected to critically examine their alleged white Jewish privilege or to use it strategically in conflicts to support oppressed groups. And then this view gets extended to Israel-Palestine. So Jewish Israelis are considered as white, whether they're Ashkenazim or not, and therefore not in need of protection. And this leads to a lack of empathy also towards individuals on the ground, towards Israelis, and also a dangerous link is opened up to the stereotype, to the old stereotype of Jewish power, because because of their whiteness, Jews are perceived as overprivileged. And of course, this black and white binary that's inherent, it cannot grasp anti-Semitism. It cannot understand the specifics of it because it doesn't fit into that, and it cannot understand the kind of the historical development of anti-Semitism in the United States and what a struggle it has been, what a struggle over race making has happened over the centuries. So it really contributes to making anti-Semitism invisible, and in the worst sense, even kind of strengthening that notion of Jewish power. I had an interview partner who was also very critical of this, and he said, Jews are the epitome of white imperialism. He didn't mean that, but that was his view on the mainstream left perception. Jews are the epitome of white imperialism, and I think that really brings it together. And that also leads me to the other theoretical foundation, anti-imperialism, that deeply impacts the perception of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and of anti-Semitism. It results in a binary worldview that reduces complex power constellations to the opposition between imperialist states and anti-imperialist counter movements. It contrasts kind of bad nationalism with good emancipatory nationalism. And this has direct impact on the perception of the Middle East conflict. Interestingly enough, this is something that comes from a tradition. In my book, I also have a long chapter on kind of historical traditions of how the left perceived anti-Semitism. And of course, this theoretical foundation comes from Marxist-Leninist theory. Not from Marxism per se, but from Marxism-Leninism. And to this day, it was more prominent in those members, in those activists who are members of socialist groups, of traditional socialist groups. And the third theoretical foundation that I expected, but I didn't find so much, is personalized, personified forms of anti-capitalism or critiques of capitalism that contrast the productive real economy imagined as positive with an unproductive circulation sphere. reject this as negative. This is something that's, that's important for left discourses, left anti-Semitism discourses in Europe, not so much in the United States. I also didn't find that, I was surprised that, that Occupy Wall Street didn't bring that up again. It was an anti-capitalist movement, and I didn't see this kind of anti-Semitism so much. Now, the third form, kind of on the micro level, moving towards the individuals now, or the role of identity. What I generally found surprising is that there wasn't any relevant difference between the attitudes of Jewish and non-Jewish respondents. There were some, I can talk about that later, but in general, they were similar, and this leads me to, I think that this points to the fact that certain forms of anti-Zionism particularly are really more expression of an affiliation of a certain milieu. However, ideas of identity do influence anti-Semitism discourses, and this goes particularly for the Jewish left. It's a dynamic that also emerges from discussions around universalism, particularism, Israel, the Holocaust within the American Jewish community in recent years that I'm sure many of you are aware of, and the fact that many Jewish leftists oppose this notion of Israel and Holocaust as kind of the central pillars of Jewish American identity, and seek to express their own alternative new rituals of dissent, as Alvin Rosenfeld has called this. And all of these debates revolve around anti-Semitism kind of as a cipher. Jewish organizations are accused of instrumentalizing the concept of anti-Semitism, especially to delegitimize dissidents. And my sense was that, especially in the interviews, the Jewish respondents see as the starting point of their criticism, but also as the target point of their criticism, the other members of the Jewish community. And the problem arises that even if the intended audience is the Jewish community, any statement is of course also received in other contexts. So this condemnation of Jewish organizations and their strategies, it does sometimes actually encourage stereotypes of excessive Jewish power, or a critique of Holocaust remembrance that contributes to anti-Semitic images of victim-perpetrator inversion, or the fact that Jews can involuntarily be used as alleged guarantors that a statement is supposedly not anti-Semitic. But this question of identity is not limited to the negotiation of being Jewish, but also relates to the left as such. So anti-Zionism really has become more than an actual realpolitik position about Israel and the Middle East. It has become what Shulamit Volkov many years ago already has called a subcultural code. So in a way, anti-Zionism signifies being on the right side of history, opposing imperialism, opposing colonialism, opposing racism, opposing nationalism, oppression. And the counter principle in that kind of worldview is then necessarily Zionism. And the Israel-Palestinian conflict really becomes like a global political pivot for left identity. In a sense, that it also explains why Israel comes up in the most unlikely situations. I mean, this is a front banner for a demonstration after the shooting of Michael Brown. This is in Seattle. I mean, this is what the demonstration started with, a demonstration against racist police violence in the United States. And it reads, I mean, if anyone is not watching, it reads, "Occupation is a crime, Ferguson to Palestine, resist US racism, boycott Israel." And I mean, there are many examples where Israel really comes up in the most absurd settings, yeah, so it really this really has to do with the fact that anti-Zionism has become this subcultural code, and it's something that also speaks to kind of the crisis on the left. Moshe Postone has done great work on that, claiming that after 9/11, really this has become kind of a substitute theory. Alleged theory. That was something where, you know, all other kind of global left visions fell apart. Anti-Zionism took on this role of you know, something that apparently everyone can rally around. Yeah, Jonathan Judekin has said, you know, anti-Semitism thus now serves as a proxy for differing positions on the Arab-Israeli conflict. So really, you know, we have like these kind of ideological package deals. Leftists accuse the Zionists, which is also like this, you know, this group that you cannot really grasp. I mean, it's also, you know, nothing or no one concrete, of cultivating a phony concern about anti-Semitism. And anyone who talks about anti-Semitism is perceived as Zionist and racist. I had another non-Jewish interview partner that you already met. He comments again critically on these dynamics by saying, and it's all centered around Israel. It's all centered around that. So it doesn't even matter if someone says something anti-Semitic that's not even relevant to Israel, because if you call someone anti-Semitic, therefore you're automatically a Zionist and a racist. So what are the political implications? Really quick. You know, of course, obviously, anti-Semitism cannot even be addressed. You know, whether it's something that cannot be brought up. Anyone who brings it up is often accused of having like a dishonest hidden agenda. By consequence, the concrete concerns of Jews are often not heard. So I talked to, I call her Ziva. She's the daughter of Holocaust survivors, and she's been active for many decades in the peace movement and feminist groups. And she said, I've been very silent. I think most Jews are silent because the left is very strong pro-Palestine, and people who speak out against that are being accused of being right-wing. And there's no room for, it's so emotionally charged, there's no room for dialogue. And she, you know, continued to tell me how she felt not at ease at demonstrations and actually considered leaving the country. The second effect is that Jews in left spaces, because of their identity, are often asked about their positions on Israel. They're thus indirectly treated separately and threatened with exclusions from the movement. If the same thing happened with other social minorities, I'm sure that would be called out. I mean, you know, a conflation between religious and ethnic identities in another country. I mean, I don't know, for example, the demand that Arab Americans should distance themselves from Islamist terrorism simply because of their identity. This is something that would be called out as racist in many parts of the left, not so with Jews who are simply by being Jewish called out for Israel's crime. This was also the case, you might remember the case of the 2019 Chicago Dyke March, where Jewish women were asked to leave because of this flag, because it apparently was triggering and seen as associated with Israel. Yeah, so finally, some thoughts on what to do with that. I mean, my general observation is that I would call anti-Semitism a doubly invisible prejudice on the left. I have a German book out by the title, The Invisible Prejudice, and I mean that in the dual sense. So the first kind of invisibility is that although it's occasionally articulated, it's something that's, you know, rarely expressed openly. It's more often communicated through innuendo, through fragments. And secondly, and almost more importantly, this prejudice is rarely spoken about. It cannot be brought up without controversy. This anti-Semitic trivialization really is the norm. And of course, you know, we know from, I mean, sociology understands that people perceive a certain issue as a problem or not, less so on the basis of objective factors, but more on the basis of social processes. And I want to explain why this lack of sensitivity happens. And I think that there's, you know, different factors, and it's too simple to say it is because of anti-Semitism, but this is one contributing factor. And of course, you know, it's been a decade since this research was carried out, but I do think that these results are more relevant than ever. The discussions, the dynamics on the left and related media discussions have really come to a head. The BDS movement has become more visible. Academic boycotts have been frequently debated, and they have been passed by numerous professional organizations. Yeah, and at the same time, of course, there have been major changes in society as a whole. So, as you know, anti-Semitism, which seemed to have nearly disappeared, has become very visible again in word and in deed. It's no longer a lighthearted thing, and the left also acknowledges that. Most people on the left admit that, of course, the rise of the alt-right, the empowerment of white supremacies, has had violent consequences on Jewish institutions. And secondly, the election of Trump in 2016 has brought, in a way, a very fragmented left together again. And, you know, for the first time in many years, liberals, traditional communist organizations, neo-anarchists, and others have joined together for some years in opposition to the president. So, you know, this role of anti-Zionism at least for some milieus, became less important. And so, yeah, so I think my outlook is like an ambivalent one. On the one hand, I see, like I just mentioned, this rise of BDS, this rise of boycotts. On the other hand, there has been debate on left and on anti-Semitism, not just of the right, but also on the left. I mean, I'm thinking of some texts that are already a bit older, but some that are also fairly new that came up. I'm also thinking of small things. I mean, I'm thinking of, you know, the 2017 Women's March, which in DC, which was kind of the first big protest after Trump's inauguration, where Angela Davis spoke out in favor of an inclusive intersectional feminism, and called for the resistance to racism, to Islamophobia, to anti-Semitism, to misogyny, to capitalist exploitations. Now, you know, Angela Davis' positions towards Israel are another story, but I found it interesting that that contemporary anti-Semitism was invoked on that list, because that list was often very free of anti-Semitism in the years before. But I also have the sense that that list only includes anti-Semitism from the right. And I think this book is an example, which came out in 2017 by Jewish Voice for Peace on anti-Semitism, which, you know, doesn't really include scholars on anti-Semitism or activists on anti-Semitism, but mostly anti-Zionist authors. And a large part of the texts actually talk again about the accusation of anti-Semitism rather than about anti-Semitism itself. So again, a book that claims to be about anti-Semitism, but actually is not. And if so, it's about anti-Semitism from the right, and it doesn't call for critical self-reflection. So yes. And at the same time, I showed you these texts, there have been in recent months, several events, I mean, I'm thinking of the Institute for Social Ecology that repeatedly does a seminar series that I also am a part of, Understanding Anti-Semitism, Historical Roots and Contemporary Relevance, which also includes sessions on left anti-Semitism. I mean, with great authors like Peter Staudenmeier, for example. I'm thinking of the YIVO Institute that had a panel, Leftists on Left-Wing Anti-Semitism, something that was encouraged by Spencer Sunshine, who's also been very active spokesperson from the left and in the left. So, you know, I mean, these examples are few and far between, but it's really something that has not been the case 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. We can only hope that these kind of learning processes and arguments will continue. I mean, we know from the German example that, you know, this is something that doesn't happen within a year or two. My hope is that, I mean, through the horrible, the horrible developments in the US in the last years when it comes to anti-Semitism, that also on the left, at least, there is a certain renewed awareness, at least towards anti-Semitism on the right. And my sense is that in left media outlets, I mean, I'm also thinking of Jewish Currents that had a very controversial editorial recently entitled How Not to Fight Anti-Semitism, but it was immediately met with a lot of criticism from within Jewish and non-Jewish left circles. So, you know, there's a debate going on, and that was not the case a few years back. So we'll see where that is headed. As you can see, I'm not sure whether to be optimistic or pessimistic. And yes, maybe I'll leave it on that ambivalent note and turn to you and turn to the questions and discussion.